If you enjoy my videos, don't forget to like them, share them, and subscribe to my channel. And remember, small YouTube channels like this can't be monetized, so if you're able to support me by becoming a patron, it really helps. My Patreon link is in the description. Okay, so Cormac's Cup, or Cormac's Adventures in the Otherworld. This is probably 3 or 4 centuries later than the Voyage of Bran. I always say this every time. That's the text, not necessarily the story. There's a more up-to-date translation of this tale, but it's not online. It's in this book called The Celtic Heroic Age, which, as you can see, is quite a nicely printed and laid out book too. So once Cormac, the grandson of Conn, was in Leitrim, that is Tara. He saw a lone warrior, sober and grey-haired, approaching him across the green of the stronghold. It is thus that he was, a peaceful branch, or branch of the Shee, in his hand, with 3 apples of red gold upon it. So this word Shee, in Old Irish, there's no way to tell whether it means peace or whether it means the good folk. So it's a branch of the Shee, kind of has 2 interpretations or 2 layers of meaning. So this was in his hand with 3 apples of red gold upon it, and it was not known what wood it was. And when it was shaken, the sound of the apples was sweeter than all the music in the world, and the men of the world would sleep to that music, and there would be no sorrow or care on anyone who heard that music. Then Cormac felt a great, unbearable love for the branch, and said that he would give him 3 of the best gifts in Ireland in exchange for it. And the warrior gave him the branch and bound him to yield those 3 gifts up to him whenever he should come ask for them. Then Cormac shook the branch in Drimcan, in other words, in Tara, and all of the people of Ireland, men, children, and women, fell into a single slumber of sleep. I love this concept that they're all in one sleep together. That's kind of cool. So the silver branch is kind of interesting. We get a more elaborate description of it here than we do in the Voyage of Bran. It's almost like a portable version of the properties of the otherworld. At the same time, it's almost like a bit of an opiate or something. Cormac craves it. He wants to hang on to it. Bran responds to it a bit the same way in his story. And it's interesting how Cormac uses the branch he traded for his children to soothe the sorrow created by the loss of those children. So the story itself kind of falls into 3 sections. The first part is set in Cormac's court as he gets the silver branch, and then he gradually loses his children. And I don't think there's a great deal to say about that part of the story. Then he finds himself in the otherworld, where he sees the 3 strange allegorical scenes. The warriors endlessly thatching the roof because they aren't using pins or scallops to pin the bird's wings down to the roof, so they just keep sliding off. Then he sees the guy who cuts and burns tree trunk after tree trunk, and they're just consumed, and he has to go get another one. And finally, he sees the well with 5 streams, and the hazels and the salmon. So that's the second part. And then there's the part in Manannán's court where the stories are told and the things he saw are explained, and he receives the cup. So that's probably the most interesting part. The first 3 truths that are told are much more of a kind of tall tale, or reinforcing the abundance found in the otherworld, the inexhaustible supply of everything that's needed. Although I did find it interesting that the characters, including Manannán and his queen there, seem to describe a time before they had these things, which implies they didn't always have them. So the servants got their stuff in disputes, but Manannán and his wife just have, or mysteriously discover theirs. You know, he talks about, I went to cut the grain and it was already cut. I went to stack it, it was already stacked, and so on. I don't think this is a question we're going to answer as far as where they were before this happened. But it does imply that they have a story before this. The thatching of the house and the burning of the great tree trunks seems to be chiefly about the futility of things, as Manannán explains it to Cormac. The explanation of the 5 streams is interesting, though. Only the version translated by Stokes have a full description of this. This is what Cormac sees before he gets into Manannán's court. This is just in front of it or just outside the house. Then he sees in the garth a shining fountain with 5 streams flowing out of it, and the hosts in turn drinking its water. 9 hazels of buin grew over the well. The purple hazels drop their nuts into the fountain, and the 5 salmon, which are in the fountain, sever them and send their husks floating down the streams. Now the sound of the falling of those streams is more melodious than any music that men sing. So I'm sure you'll all recognize that this is what's sometimes called Nechtin's well, which is supposedly at the source of the river Boyne. And it's associated with Boan and later with Finn McCool. And this is what Manannán tells him it means. It's the fountain which thou sawest with the 5 streams out of it is the fountain of knowledge, and the streams are the 5 senses through which knowledge is obtained. And Stokes seems to have a question about that word when he's translating it. And no one will have knowledge who drinketh not a draught out of the fountain itself and out of the streams. The folk of many arts are those who drink of them both. So this bringing in of the 5 senses is, I think, unique to this text. So in this longer version of the text, Cormac's cup is framed by discussions concerning judgment and the law, as well as fitness to rule and so on. So I don't find it the most exciting text, as I was saying. And if you only skimmed it, I do understand. However, I would suggest that law and judgment may be one of Manannán's spheres that is a little bit overlooked sometimes, because it isn't very often ever stated outright. So there are hints of it in the part of the story we've looked at too, with the truth telling, the cup that breaks, and the food won't be cooked unless truth is told, and so on. I think there might be a relevant similarity between a few locations associated with Manannán and Manawydan and places of council and judgment. So you will remember the Tynwald. We know that Manannán is associated with the Tynwald court on Man. And remember how the path to this place from the church at the other end of the path is strewn with rushes at midsummer, which is just a Manannán thing on Man. So this stepped structure represents the original meeting place of the Manx Tynwald. Now Tynwald, here you can see it here, a little dictionary definition, comes from the Old Norse, thing or ting, meaning a place of assembly, and voller, a field, so Tynwald. And this little quote here is from the government Tynwald website, from their history page. And they say, for well over 1,000 years, the inhabitants of the Isle of Man have gathered here at midsummer to hear the laws of their land proclaimed, to seek justice, and to air their grievances. So I would argue that there's little difference between this structure and what is called a gorsedd, like the gorsedd are berth in the Mabinogi that we've heard mentioned a couple of times today. Not physically, I'm not saying the gorsedd our berth looked like this, but it was some kind of a hill or mound, almost certainly. And here's the dictionary definition of gorsedd, a word with multiple related meanings. So this is from the big historical dictionary of Welsh. Meaning 1, a mound of earth, tump, knoll, hillock, barrow, tumulus, grave. This sounds a little like Carrie's list of things that are openings to the other world. Meaning B, throne of an emperor or king, throne of a bishop, etc., on ceremonial occasions. Chair, confessional, throne of God in Christ, figurative position, office or dignity of a sovereign, and sovereign power and authority. And maybe this begins to help you also see why Taliesin talks about his chair in Caer City, his seat in Caer City, and the chair of Ceridwen, and so on. It's a place of dignity. And of course, chairs are associated with modern bards as well in Wales and Cornwall and such places. And finally, meaning C, a llys, a court, a hall, a dwelling, a court of law. So the first court is like a king's court. Courts of law kind of grew out of king's courts. Judicial assembly, tribunal, session, a judge's seat, assembly, a gathering. So gorsedd, big package of related meanings there. So when you combine these with Manawydan's association with the gorsedd Arberth, there does seem to be a trend. And that trend is continued in texts like Cormac's story and others, where judgment and wisdom seem to be important factors. So you might remember the lines from Who's the Doorkeeper? Manawyddan, son of Llŷr, profound was his counsel. Manawyd carried off shields, pierced and battle-stained. So hold that thought. So that text, profound was his counsel, and then in the next breath, describing his prowess as a warrior. It kind of contrasts the wisdom and counsel aspect of Manannán and the warrior aspect in much the same way that it's dealt with in Cormac. Manannán is described as a warrior. A warrior appeared with this branch, although he's a mature one, but it's his wisdom and his association with good judgment which is featured in the story. Well, where I'm going with this is that this association with the law and judgment, which certainly in early Wales and Ireland was also a precise instrument dealing with right and wrong, guilt and innocence, is somewhat in contrast to what we've discovered about the other world, which is extremely fluid and ambiguous. And to some extent, I think this describes Manannán himself. I mean, he's mysterious to the point of being nebulous at times, and yet he's associated with very concrete concepts like sovereignty and judgment. So at the same time, he seems a bit morally ambiguous himself at times.